wave to them in the corner when we're ready. Okay. Much like Pastor Joel this morning when everybody was having such a good time, and then he said, "Okay, folks, we gotta get started." That's what David and I are going to do right now. But we know you don't want to be here all day, so we wanted to talk to you a little about Guns to Gardens. How many of you are familiar with the term Guns to Gardens? A little bit. Okay. So that's what we wanted to talk to you about, and then we're happy to answer any questions. But then we know that you're not going to absorb all this today, so please use us as a resource at another time. So, David?
Well, this is my chance to say good morning to all of you. And again, thank you for the welcome. As Kris described the beginnings of God Before Guns, which is actually 10 years old right about now. We've done a lot of different things over the years, and as we were saying to someone in conversation a few minutes ago, there's 100 different things we can do together to help reduce gun violence. And our encouragement is for everybody to find a niche, find a starting place, just do something. And that's one of the reasons we make presentations like this. God Before Guns has done legislative work. We've done many of these presentations to church audiences. Kris has preached innumerable sermons. I will say she does preach about things other than gun violence, but when she puts the God Before Guns T-shirt on, she brings that to churches. We sponsor vigils, we've done marches, we've done rallies, we've done a lot of different things. But in the last couple of years, we have gotten more involved in this thing called Guns to Gardens. And just to give you a very thumbnail sketch of what it is, and then we'll show you a video here that Jim will cue up for us again. Guns to Gardens is an effort to get guns out of homes, unwanted guns. We don't pretend that we're collecting crime guns. We don't pretend to be taking guns off the streets. Criminals are not going to come and drop off their guns. That's not what it is. Guns to Gardens is an effort to give people who have guns that they want to get rid of, and in many cases need to get rid of, giving them a safe way to do it, an easy way to do it. And Guns to Gardens then, well, of course, the swords to plowshares symbolism is very strong for Christians. We all understand what that means. And the Guns to Gardens concept is that not only will we collect guns, but we will also destroy them, and when possible, and as much as possible, we will convert those destroyed guns into something that symbolizes peace. In many cases, it's works of art, but also, the obvious thing is turning them into garden tools. And we already heard the reference today, you've already seen the reference to Mike Martin. Well, Mike Martin is actually a guy that we met in 2019 when he was doing a tour of the country with Reverend Shane Claiborne. One of his stops was in Cleveland, where we hosted Mike and Reverend Shane. Well, it's Reverend Mike, too. And their tour was called Beating Guns. And that's where we first saw this sort of activity in action. And let me just have Jim show you. Will you show that short video that you had up before? This is Mike Martin, and before you press play, let me give you just one piece of context. We knew what was going on. We knew that they were going to come, and we knew that one of the things they did is destroy guns. Just hit pause there for a second. And so what God Before Guns did is we bought ourselves an AR-15. And I bought this from a guy who sold it to me from the trunk of his car in a Home Depot parking lot. Now, what we did was perfectly legal in Ohio. I didn't need a background check. The only thing that the seller had to do was try to be sure that he was selling to somebody who was in the state of Ohio, because as long as he was selling it to another Ohio resident, he didn't have to do any paperwork. He didn't have to do anything except take the money and give me the gun. So I showed him my driver's license. I walked away with an AR-15, an operable weapon. And we bought this gun so we could do this. This is Mike Marks.
Have you guys ever had anybody like see you outside of a church with that and be like, oh my God?
Freak out? Well,
yeah.
I think little kids
some
around.
eyes
I
raised.
better wrap
I'm
it up.
sure. Like,
This is an ugly thing to be carrying around. Although in
especially
Ohio,
these days at churches.
it's perfectly legal to wrap around.
Are you serious?
Same with my town.
This is in front of a church in Cleveland.
So it's like, oh, so you can't prevent them not shooting until they literally start fighting.
Exactly.
Like, fighting. That's insane.
That happened at our house. I'll tell you a story.
Right here, and just make space for one another. Those of us that have the flash paper can burn it in solidarity, but let's hold a sacred silence as our sisters and brothers take the hammer here, and feel free to burn your papers anytime you feel moved.
At this event, we had a number of gun violence survivors.
If you'd like to participate, you can begin the family line behind them.
Yes.
All right. Yes. Come on, Terrence.
That's a molten piece of the AR-15. You can pull that out before.
Yeah.
The survivors, all
For every kid that has ever suffered from gun violence,
Yes.
my cousin, my son-in-law.
Jennifer McCoy, my sister.
Well, it takes a while to turn that into a tool, but this is the ultimate result of that AR-15 that we destroyed and repurposed. We have some additional tools here that we brought today that have been made by these have all been forged by amateur blacksmiths. This one you can sort of see the gun barrel aspect of it. Here's another one that was a gun barrel. And other parts of the gun can be turned into pieces of art as well. So not to go on too long about the Guns to Gardens project, but as I said before, it's about getting unwanted guns out of homes. And what we've discovered, and there are groups around the country that have been doing this for years. Many of them are faith communities, but some of them are what we would just call gun violence prevention groups. There's a gun violence prevention organization in New Mexico that has collected thousands of guns over the years. In many cases, these guns are turned in what we call a buyback, which means they bring in a gun, they get something in return, typically gift cards. We've been using gift cards to grocery stores and Target. We avoid gift cards to any business that actually sells guns or ammunition. We're trying to keep some separation there. But actually, some organizations have had success doing what they call give-backs, which means no compensation. We'll just take your gun, and they bring in guns. So that seems to work well also. So the idea of a gun buyback or a gun safe surrender event, again, it's not that we can say that we're preventing crime. You know, you can't exactly prove the negative. You can't prove that by turning in a gun, a life was saved. But what we do know, what is easy to say, and what is clearly obvious, is that a gun that's turned in and destroyed will never be used for a suicide. It'll never be used by some kid who found it and accidentally discharged it. It'll never be used to threaten someone. It will never be stolen and used in a crime. And as you probably know, guns are now the hot thing to steal from homes and from cars. You know, they started saying a few years ago that people stopped putting NRA stickers on their bumpers because their cars were being broken into. And, you know, thieves would look for a gun first because it's, you know, easy to remove and valuable. So a gun that's turned in will not be used for any of those kinds of things. Absolutely. And that's one of the selling points of a gun buyback sort of event. And so let me suffice to say that one of the things we've been saying to faith communities as we talk to them in the last couple of years has been, this is something you might want to do. We've had several of them in Ohio in the past 2 years. We've been involved in 4 of them directly so far. There are 2 more that we have on the calendar coming up this year. There is a National Gun Buyback Day, which is Saturday, June 10th. That's the Guns to Gardens designated day for a national gun buyback. But having said that, Guns to Gardens will support any buyback at any time. You know, it doesn't have to be on that particular day. So, you know, a date that works better for the group that wants to do it is just fine. There are some basic concepts that we ask those groups to follow, and but there is a lot of flexibility too on how you do it. We like to connect gun buybacks to blacksmiths, because if you have a blacksmith, you have a way to start converting those guns into something else. And we have built up some connections, and as Kris was mentioning earlier today, one of our favorite ministers, an Episcopal priest, was having a little trouble finding a blacksmith, so she decided to learn to do it herself, and now she's blacksmithing at her own events. So there are a number of ways to get started and to get around any issues that may arise, and we are happy to help organize. So let me just pause and ask if you have any questions you'd like to ask about Guns to Gardens and we would also certainly entertain any questions you might have about God before guns as well. Yes? There have been many proposals over the years. You know, one of the great frustrations, as I'm sure you're aware, of legislative activity is that we've had so much trouble getting anywhere in legislatures and in Congress. It seems with the Supreme Court's current direction, more and more gun restrictive laws are being struck down. So, yes, there are proposals for limiting how ammo is sold, and also for, as you may have heard, the micro-stamping of ammunition so that the bullets can be traced back to a gun and even the owner of the gun. But so far, those things aren't moving forward as far as I know. It's one of those good ideas that, at the moment, doesn't seem to be going anywhere fast. Yeah. Well, yeah. You know, the manufacturers will fight all the way, you know, against any sort of taxation or regulation like that. But yes. Well, there are major gun violence prevention organizations like Everytown and Moms Demand Action, which are essentially one organization. Also, Giffords, started by Gabby Giffords, that do research on questions like what is the economic impact of gun violence. And you know, I don't want to sound like too much of a skeptic, but like the question about ammunition, the cost that's been estimated of gun violence every year, the economic cost, is huge, and yet it doesn't seem to matter to the people who cast the votes, you know, for on gun violence legislation.
Right. Right. Well, we, you know, you can look at, since our organization was formed in the wake of the Sandy Hook shootings, as were many others. That's when Moms Demand Action started as well. Many did. That we can say that, well, that galvanized people, and there was a big jump in gun violence prevention activists and groups, you know, doing the work. There was. But then you see the flip side of, okay, what would it take to change things if 21st graders didn't change things? So, but we keep reaching these times where, you know, okay, well, Parkland High School, that's the one that's, but I will say that each time that more people get on board and decide that this is something that I'm not going to ignore anymore, this is something I'm going to do something about, I'm going to do what I can where I can, Now, legislatively, we've been in the halls of Congress. We have done testimony at the Ohio State House. If you've done work there yourself, you know that's a tough grind. We were testifying against the Stand Your Ground bill that passed during lame duck a few years ago. And they had the hearing. We were there, I don't know, late at night one time. And then another time I was testifying, and of the committee of 10, one legislator stayed in the room to hear testimony. And it was standing room only, a packed testimony room. But I guess according to their rules, only one person had to be there. So, it's tough, but I say that not to give up, but to say who's your state rep here by this church? Do you know who your state rep or senator is? Okay, Emily Sykes, okay. Oh, that's right, she's in Congress now. Well, anyway, get to know who your state representatives are, and then keep calling them, and keep emailing them, and keep writing to them. And, do that with we did it with Rob Portman for years. I'm not saying he ever actually listened to us, but we kept at it. So keep doing it. But I will say that our group is grassroots. We don't have paid staff, and so legislatively, we have always worked together with larger groups.
Yeah, just to echo what Kris was saying, by no means do we believe that we can become discouraged with legislation, because ultimately legislation is a huge part of making progress on this thing. But there are other things we can do. I will recommend Moms Demand Action. Right now, Moms is the force on legislation in Ohio. They're the ones who pack a room. So, if legislation is something you're interested in, that's a great group to be part of. Yes?
Okay. Your question's a good one. And it's, we can only go where we are invited. But we also have used the public square a lot, too. We've been out in public, and we've had events where guys with guns show up, and stand, 30 feet from us with an AR-15 slung over their shoulder, So it's hard to have conversation with some gun people. But over 90% of Americans favor stronger background checks. Well, that's got to include a whole lot of gun owners. But, getting the gun violence prevention activists like us and people who, pry the gun from my cold dead hands, that's a great divide. So what we have been doing, what we've been engaged in over the last 10 years, is to work on being invited into churches or faith communities. We're not just Christian, we're multi-faith organization, where we know, nobody asked you when we came in if you agreed with us, but you invited us here. So we're hoping that what we've been able to do over the 10 years is to bring people into awareness of the issue. And then once you're aware of how pervasive this issue is, then to move you into some form of activism about it. Now, I think because over these last 10 years, we're getting worn down by the amount of gun violence, and numbers are climbing again. More and more people are already aware. So today you invited us in, but you're already starting. You're already starting. And that's what we have found last spring when the Buffalo grocery store shootings happened, and Uvalde, Texas, and then there was another congregation in California, all within just days of each other. Rather than us looking for a church to host a vigil that we would put on, we had churches contacting us saying, we're going to hold a vigil. Would you come in and speak, or would you come in and do something? So we can see already that more churches are willing to have the conversation. They're more willing to invite us in. More pastors, and I understand the difficulty of being a local pastor and, preaching about tough stuff. But more pastors are willing to look at this and say, this is just too important not to pay attention to. So we may never convince some people, but if we can move people into more awareness and more activism, then we've done what I think God is calling us to do. I mean, we think that if you're going to argue pro-life, that gun violence could be part of that conversation, and we've had that conversation with lots of people. But does that answer your? Right. Yeah. And I've mentioned Shane Claiborne a few times today. Shane is an evangelical pastor, and then also Rob Schenk, who led some national evangelical association and was very, very pro-life stance, came out and spoke about gun violence, and so now is a strong advocate. So there are evangelical voices out there that are, that may be heard in a different way than, these progressive disciples of Christ people.
At the time we bought the gun, we were also helping with a campaign to get a ballot initiative in Ohio that would require background checks on all gun sales. That initiative attempt failed because it is a difficult thing to get an initiative in front of the Ohio voters. So the current state of the law is that if you buy a gun from a licensed gun dealer, licensed by the federal government, which is where most people buy their guns. Most people go and buy a new gun. And if you buy a gun from a dealer, you have to pass a background check. Now, there are problems with the background check system itself, but at least you have to fill out the form and submit it and wait to see if you get the approval. But the so-called gun show loophole means that if you buy from a private party, not a licensed dealer, you don't need a background check. So if somebody wants to sell you a gun in the parking lot of a Home Depot, you can do it, perfectly legal. There's nothing to stop that. You're not allowed to cross over into Indiana and do that. So interstate is where the federal rules begin to take over again. But within the state, it's very easy to buy, not only to just plain buy a gun. Kris often tells the story of how she's gone to high school classes, and she'll ask the kids, how many of you have been affected by gun violence? And everybody raises their hand. And then she says, how many of you know how to get a gun? And everybody raises their hand. It's very easy to buy a gun, and it's very easy to buy a gun without a background check and do it legally in Ohio. So that's where we are. And, you know, not to go on to, you know, our old line is don't get us started. We just made it easier in Ohio last year to carry a gun in public with no permit, no background check, which used to be part of the permit, and no training whatsoever. All you have to do now, the only thing you have to do now to legally carry a gun in Ohio is to be old enough to buy that gun legally. All right? That's it. As long as you're not somebody who has a prohibition because you're a convicted felon or something, you can carry a gun. Yes.
Well, I think you start by listening to what they're experiencing. Before we actually started, I said we started at Sandy Hook, but as a pastor in Cleveland Heights, I went through. Do you remember when there was a school shooting at Chardon High School? Okay, that happened in February of 2012, and I had kids at the church who were at the high school that day. And we had a youth group event that afternoon at church. I didn't think the kids from Chardon would come, but they did. So it was an opportunity to sit and listen. And I found out then, and this was in 2012, that all kids, whether they were in Euclid schools, Cleveland Heights, Chardon, wherever, that they had dealt with lockdown in some way. So, I mean, that's why we started. We also are involved with it's called Peace Camp, that an organization called Peace in the Hood in Cleveland, 99 Treasures, puts on a summer peace camp. And in fact, the kids melted down guns this year when we went. But to listen to what their experiences are, because these kids are living, they're living either through the drills at school or through gunshots in their neighborhoods or whatever. And I'm sure that there are curriculums out there, to help you deal with that. But the first part is acknowledging that they're dealing with this. Okay. Well, except that gun violence now is affecting everybody everywhere. I mean, certainly the issues for kids in Cleveland would be more going back and forth to school or after school. But we know of countless other upper income private schools where there have been school shootings. So, without scaring kids to death. I mean, it really is something that we can't just say gun violence or even school violence and lump it all together as that it's all the same, because it isn't. It's trauma anyway that it happens. So I would think that kids would listen now, because, well, in this room, for example, I want to ask you a question. How many of you know someone who has been killed or injured by a gun? And this would include suicide. Okay, would you say a third to 40% of the room? Yeah. It's estimated now that in our country that probably 50% of us have known someone who was killed or injured. And so, these kids, in some other school systems, they're dealing with teen suicides. So that's an approach. They may know a kid who. Okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, it's a work in progress. It's a work in progress. And sadly, sometimes people don't come to the realization that it can happen everywhere until it happens to someone they love. And while we are certainly not wishing that on anyone, it is now an issue where kids, even in Hudson, may know of somebody, or somebody in their family. So it's, we just have to be diligent. We just have to keep at it. But there's lots of tough subjects to talk to kids about. Yeah.
Well, it would be easy for us to go on for a long time, but, we, of course, do need to bring things to a close. I want to mention again that the Guns to Gardens concept is something that I hope you will think about and talk about, and certainly we are very available to assist in helping you get started. And as I was telling Pastor Joel, there are a number of resources that weren't around even just a year ago. So we've gotten so we pretty well know how to do this. We just need a group that says we're going to do it, and we're going to come up with some volunteers and put the pieces together. So we offer that as a good step forward, and one that can, as I was saying before, get guns out of homes where they can, of course, do great harm and oftentimes do very unexpectedly. And then I'll also say that on the question of hope, we talked some about legislation, and Kris made some observations about that. I want to add one more observation, and that is that in recent years, in the 10 years that we've been involved in this, I have found great hope in the fact that many, many candidates for office are now talking about gun safety and about gun violence. 10 years ago, nobody was. I remember being very disappointed that, my candidate for president, Barack Obama, would not talk about it, because at the time, it was well known that this was a third rail, something you don't want to talk about because it'll only cost you votes. Well, those days seem to be over. Now, we don't have enough legislators yet talking in support of gun violence prevention, but there's more and more and more, and that's good news, and it's one good reason to keep the pressure on our legislators to be doing more. But we also have a culture change that we have to talk about, and we have to also get people to think about the fear that's leading them to consider buying a gun, and if they are people of faith, to think about what their faith means. What would God have me do? And we know Christians are divided on this, but that's how God Before Guns got started. To get people to say, yeah, I may have guns, and I lived most of my life in an area that was rural and had a lot of guns around for hunting. And God Before Guns has never been against guns. But we believe that, that America has reached a point where it worships guns and where we put the Second Amendment ahead of the First Commandment. And that's why we started this, and that's what our organization is about.
We will leave as a parting gift for you these gun safety cards that we have distributed. We were just distributing over Northeast Ohio, but since Guns to Gardens has grown all over the country, they're as far away as California and Maine and all over the place. But it's a card that recognizes that people own guns. I'm not going to ask here who owns a gun, but people own guns. But we're asking that you know about how to safely store your gun and alternatives to guns and whatever. So these are for you to have here at your church, and if you need more, just let us know. So, yes.
What is the date again of, did you say June 10 for the?
Yeah, it's a Saturday. I think it's the 10th.
Yeah.
And I think they're also talking about maybe designating 2 Saturdays in June because, somebody of course will have a conflict.
That would be quick to try to pull together. I'm not saying it would be impossible, but it would be quick. But we do know there's one going on that weekend in Euclid, Ohio at Church of the Epiphany, and they've already done one. That would be a good one to visit. It would be. Yes. There's one we know of, and you can email me about this. There's one coming up in May that's at Forest Hill Presbyterian that in Cleveland Heights. And then there's this one in Euclid. And then there's, who told me that St. Andrews is doing one? I had a conversation. Okay. That's St. Andrews in Mentor is doing their second one. That's coming up. So there are ones that you could visit, and that would be a good idea. I mean, it's still the conversations you're going to have with your local law enforcement are going to be different, but you would see, and that one in Euclid on that weekend would be a really good one to visit because they're really good at this. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I don't know that theirs was a Guns to Gardens, but they have done a gun buyback that they did in relationship with the Sheriff's Department, I believe. So that'd be another, yeah. Okay, yes? There usually are multiple donors. And because you have to decide what you're comfortable giving in gift cards for guns. And so it would be those, certainly those here in the church who would be involved, but you also are welcome to look for donations elsewhere. God Before Guns, because we're not, we don't have a physical place. So we work with organizations that are, with a faith community that's going to do it. So we have provided some resources to everyone who has contacted us. So, you'll be doing some fundraising. Thank you.